Hello and welcome back to Principles of Macroeconomics. I'm your host, Dr. B. We are currently in week 9 out of our 16-week course. Week 9. So last week, you all had that fancy thing called the midterm exam. The midterm exam we covered last week, covered chapters 1 through 11. Uh, the results were pretty mixed overall, but overall, I thought that it went pretty well for the most part. Um, that was the midterm exam. Uh, most students in the course right now are passing, which is fantastic. There are a few that are on the fence, and then we have a few that are not passing. Um, so I do want to say that the only reason why you would not pass this course is if you don't do the work. You've heard me say that several times before, and I'm kind of echoing the same thing, right? Because the reality is that the only way that you cannot pass this course is by not doing the work. Now, believe it or not, I did have one student that didn't bother to take the midterm exam. So I had to contact that student and explain to them that they need to withdraw from the course because at this point there's not a chance that they'll be able to pass. So thank you to all of you, most of you, for completing the midterm exam on time. Again, I had a student that wasn't able to do that, so that they're currently not passing the course, and so unfortunately that happens. But it's so important that you complete your work on time because the second you fall behind in this course or any other course, you know what happens, right? It kind of like becomes a snowball and it gets a little out of control, and we don't want that to happen, right? So just do the best you can by completing your work on time. The good news is with this course is if you're not satisfied with a grade that you receive on a quiz or a homework assignment, great news, you could take it a second time, right? Uh, the only things you cannot take twice are the midterm and the final. So, from that perspective, I try to give everyone the same opportunity to do the best that they can. That's what's super important. So, um, just keep that in mind. We're halfway through the course, and what that means is we're averaging about 2 chapters a week. We got let me think here. We got a few more weeks to get through, really. Weeks 9 through 12 will be in Module 3. 13 through 16 will be in Module 4. The 16th week is the final exam. So we got like 8 weeks thereabouts to get through content. Each week, again, will be about 2 chapters. And so it follows basically the same structure that the first 8 weeks followed. And that's by intention. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started and talk about production and growth and all of the fun things that are tied to production and growth. And again, since this is a macroeconomics course, we look at things from the macro level, which takes a worldview into consideration. So, what is production? What do you all think production is? What does that mean? What does it mean to produce something?
um like manufacture, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. That's 100% right. Production is essentially manufacturing, right? And we talk a lot about manufacturing for those of you who have taken my courses for accounting. We talk about manufacturing from the perspective of cost, which is what we talk a lot about in Principles of Accounting too. But the idea behind production is that countries produce products and they export those products or they use them domestically. And that's what production is. And then growth, of course, is the growth of the nation. How does a nation grow? Well, they produce more, they consume more, they export more, import more. That's how they grow, right? That's how a country grows. And so we're going to look at those kinds of factors with respect to productivity We'll look at it from a comparative perspective of different countries around the world. We'll look at the idea of productivity with respect to how quickly a country is growing. And we'll also examine ways that policies and living standards can impact growth. So there's a lot of statistics that we can look at for almost all countries to be able to make comparisons. There are a couple of key statistics that we examine in macroeconomics to really understand the growth rate of a country. We look at things like gross domestic product per capita. The word per capita means per X number of citizens. So per capita might be per 100,000 citizens, for an example. And the gross domestic product, of course, is the production level of the country, the gross domestic product. And so the level of production for the United Kingdom is $39,040 per capita. We also look at other statistics that have an influence on the social perspective, and these statistics really tell a picture of how productive a country is, and it also tells us how a country grows. So, other statistics we looked at are things like child mortality rate. In the UK, it's 0.4%. We look at things like access to sanitation facilities, which are restrooms, 100%. Educational attainment, 60%. What these factors tell us is the overall stability and growth of a country. Let's look at a few more. Here's Mexico, for example. Mexico gross domestic product is $16,640 per capita. Child mortality rates significantly higher at 1.3%. The access to sanitation facilities or restrooms, 85% for the population. Educational attainment, 30%. That's dramatically different from what we see in the United Kingdom. Let's take a look at Mali. Gross domestic product, 1,510 for the country. Child mortality rate, 11.5%, extremely high. The access to modern facilities, restrooms, 25% for the population, and the educational attainment, 7%. There's a lot of reasons why Mali is dramatically different than the United Kingdom. We can say that, Mali's government doesn't do enough for their people. Mali's education system is condensed within urban areas and not so much in rural areas. There is no running water in rural areas. There's a lack of access to healthcare in Mali to a great degree, and there's a lack of employment opportunities in Mali, and so that's why we see dramatic differences between a country like Mali and a country like the United Kingdom. So when we're looking at growth around the world, we look at growth from a personal perspective. If incomes rise, there is growth. That's what we say, because the higher the income is, the more they spend, right? Which creates growth in the economy. And so we can look at growth rates around the world for a period of time. In this example, we're looking at about 1870 to 2014, which is obviously a very large time span. We can see that at the beginning of the period, they were substantially lower. At the end of the period, they're substantially higher. Now, of course, we know that this happens due to things like inflation and overall value of currency. We know that plays an impact, but if you were to take that out of the equation, we can see that the real gross domestic product represented here shows the actual growth rates. So we see that Brazil, out of this list of countries, is the fastest growing at 2.61%. The United States is more toward the middle part, middle bottom part at 1.8%. And the United Kingdom is actually one of the slower growing rates at 1.42%. And so we see that the differences also correlate with living standards, which is somewhat surprising, or different from living standards, I should say. In Mexico or in Mali, those countries have a higher child mortality rate. They have a lower income per capita. They have a lower literacy rate. So they have a higher unemployment rate. So it's interesting to see how the actual GDP per capita is significantly different, and it's not exactly correlated with their living standards. And we can also see that there's a great disparity of gross domestic product across countries. So the countries at the top, Brazil, Japan, China, Mexico, Germany, a lot of these countries are developing countries. We call them developing countries because there is a lot of new manufacturing happening in those countries. There is a lot of investment in those countries from outside manufacturers. And so that, of course, in turn, ultimately creates a higher gross domestic product. Looking at how countries rank around the world, we need to consider their income changes and stability over time. The poorer countries typically have a necessity demand versus where a rich country has more of a not necessity, but a desired demand, if you will. For example, in a country like the United States, there's going to be a higher demand for the PS5 than there would be in a poor country like Mali. The PS5 is probably not high in demand in Mali. Why is that? Well, the demand in Mali is more toward the necessities like housing, electricity, running water, education. So there really is a large disparity between the rich and the poor countries with respect to the gross domestic product rates. There are a lot of reasons why some countries are richer than others. A lot of it has to do with the government structure. A lot of it has to do with the way that their capital systems are designed. A lot of it has to do with the types of regimes that are in place. A lot of it has to do with the level of personal investment. Some countries invest in infrastructure like educational systems, roads, water, electricity, and other countries invest elsewhere in other sectors. And so that's one of the reasons why one country would become richer than others. Like, for example, here in the United States, we were fortunate enough to have a lot of innovation here in the U.S. In the 1800s, 1900s. A lot of inventions happened during that time. We had the birth of electricity, the railway, a lot of oil. There are so many inventions and so many growth opportunities that we were fortunate enough to have. Some of that has to do with the geography, but A lot of it has to do with innovation. And the more innovative countries are, typically the richer they become. So when we talk about that innovation, the one of the things that comes to mind is productivity. And the productivity is based off of the production of goods and services, right? That's what it means to be productive. It means to produce. It means to have output from the inputs. So, with respect to productivity, we're looking at the quantity of goods and services produced based off of each unit of input to get a unit of output. A unit of input is labor hours. We work X amount of hours per day, and the output is the level of production for the company you work for, right? So if you work 8 hours a day and your job is to screw in light bulbs on cars on an assembly line, then the level of output is judged by how quickly you're doing that and how many units are being produced at that rate. So that's one way of thinking about it. So unit of input, we're talking about labor. Labor is the input. The output is what's actually being produced. And we look at it from a perspective of yield, which is the real GDP. So the word yield essentially means how much is being produced, right? So that's why we use Y as the letter here of measurement, which is the real GDP, which you could also say is the quantity of the output produced. And labor is your input, which is the quantity of the labor. So how do we measure productivity? It's the real GDP, which is the quantity being produced, divided by the amount of labor. How do you measure amount of labor? We measure that in labor hours. So if I produce 1,000 cars in we'll say 100 hours, and then 1,000 divided by 100 is our productivity, which is 10. Why do we consider productivity to be important? Well, of course, it's part of the key living standards. So if you think about it, the more productive a nation is, the higher the incomes are, typically. Okay. I need to preface that a little bit because it's not true in some countries. But in most cases, the harder you work, the more income you make. I mean, that sounds right. You know, if you work 8 hours, you get paid for 8 hours. If you work for 10 hours, you get paid for 10 hours, especially if you're a hourly labor employee. If you're salary, you get paid pretty much the same no matter how many hours you work. Okay. So, you know, there's being salary has its pros and cons. You know what I mean? But the idea is the more hours you work, the more income you make. And collectively, if the more all individuals work, the more all individuals will make. That is how we, in part, measure the real gross domestic product. So if you think about it, if the real GDP is measured by, or productivity is measured by, taking real gross domestic product, which is the actual numbers of output, the actual units produced in terms of products and services, divided by the amount of hours worked, labor, then of course, the more that you produce and the more labor you put in, the wealthier you will be. And that's what productivity tells us. The growth in productivity is determined by the growth of the living standards. So the more we work, the more we produce, the faster the growth rate is. How do we factor the growth rate? We look at year to year. So 2021, I would expect would be greater than 2020 with respect to the growth rate. I would expect that 2019 was higher than 2020. And so the growth rate really is based off of the number of units produced in terms of products and services divided by the amount of labor hours. And so that tells it, and we compare it year to year to get the percentage growth. And so that tells us that the income that individuals earn collectively is the output, right? That's what productivity tells us. Okay. I want you to think of this from a perspective of a manufacturer. A manufacturer, of course, is a company that manufactures physical products. As we manufacture physical products, we create inventory. But how do we create that inventory? We use equipment, buildings. We use property, plant, and equipment. Those are fixed assets. We use property, plant, and equipment, our fixed assets, to create goods and services. We have a building that produces pencils. We have machines that help to design the pencils. We have an assembly line the pencils come off of. We have people that are putting the pencils together, and then we sell them. That is a form of physical capital. The physical capital is the actual property, plant, and equipment that is used to produce the goods and services. So when you hear the word physical capital, think fixed assets. Fixed assets are property, plant, and equipment. For those of you who have taken accounting already, you already know that. If those of you who have not yet taken accounting, you will know that. Physical capital is property, plant, and equipment. We can identify the amount of machinery, equipment, and building structure that is used in the actual production. Okay. This is called the physical capital per worker. It's where I take my fixed assets and I divide it by my labor hours. That gives me the amount of our fixed assets being used by our employees to produce goods and services. So total assets well, it's actually not total assets. It's property, plant, and equipment. So fixed assets divided by labor, which gives us our physical capital per worker. And this amount tells me the average worker how much they're producing. An increase in this causes an increase in the yield, the amount I'm actually producing. So if my physical capital per worker increases, I expect to have an increase in output, which is the yield over labor. So in knowing that, my employees who produce our pencils and our other products that we sell, they need to have knowledge through training, through education, through experience. We call this human capital. Human capital is what you are earning right now in this course and in your other courses. You're gaining human capital. Okay, it's the knowledge that you're gaining. It's the training. It's the experience. All of these things together equal human capital. And we know that the higher the human capital is, there will be more products produced. How do I know that? Well, the more efficient you are at your job, the more you can make. If I, for example, let's say Dario, he is finishing his education, and he's one of my employees, and he produces pencils. Then I have another employee who hasn't gone to college yet, and they also produce pencils. I know that Dario is going to be faster at it. Why is that? Well, Dario has the knowledge, he has the skills and the training and the experience. So that employee will be able to produce more than the other employee who doesn't have the education, who doesn't have the training or the experience. So that's what human capital determines. The reason why you're in school right now is to advance your life, right? We're all here for a reason. Your reason is you're trying to get ahead. You're trying to get new experience, new knowledge, and you're going to use that knowledge to improve your career. That's the idea, right? That's why people go to college. Some people do because they're bored, but most people go here for a reason. And it's to improve your knowledge, to improve your experience, which overall will improve your life. So if you look at why you're here at UDC, what you plan to do, what you're doing is you're improving your human capital. And that human capital will be used in the gross domestic product by producing more. It'll be easier for you because you'll know how to do it. And it'll be better for your employer because they know you know how to do it. And you'll be more efficient at your job. The more efficient you are at your job based off of the knowledge you're gaining right now will lead to a higher gross domestic product for everyone. This is what they mean by being a productive member of society. I'm sure you've probably heard that term before. What other types of resources do we use in productivity? One is called natural resources. These are the land, the river, the mineral deposits. For example, we use wood in the construction of buildings. We use wood in the construction of a lot of things, right? We use that wood is a natural resource that comes from trees, obviously. We cut the trees down, we use the wood to create the buildings. We use the river, we distill the water from the river to create drinking water. We use the mineral deposits to create products like the chips that are in your computer and your phone that you're using right now to attend this class. That's how we use natural resources to grow. Are we responsible with it? That's not for this class to determine. But natural resources per worker, we can allocate the amount of natural resources that the business is using to each employee to then identify if the employees are utilizing the natural resources responsibly and by growing the gross domestic product for the country. So we take the amount of natural resources being used divided by the number of labor hours to equal the natural resources per worker. This should cause an increase in the real gross domestic product divided by the labor, which in turn means there will be a larger output, a larger growth. Taking a look at technology, which also, of course, improves productivity, we're using machines, computers, technology devices like cell phones, you name it, right? To overall improve the speed of production. A lot of this started with in the early 1900s when Henry Ford first developed the Model T vehicle, which was one of the first automobiles in the United States. He developed this using this thing he created called the assembly line. The assembly line is where it starts from raw materials and becomes a finished product by moving down this thing called an assembly line. So think of it like a conveyor belt. Starts in the beginning, gets all the way down to the end. By the time it hits the end, it's finished good. There's a lot of steps in between, right? Here's an example for you. Let's say we have a company that manufactures guitars, okay? At the very beginning, you have your raw materials. Those raw materials are in your storage, your yard, okay? You got lumber, the wood. You got string, and you got metal facets. That's all you got, okay? Now let's make a guitar. We take the materials out of raw materials and we put it into what we call work in process. Work in process. When it's in a work in process, it goes through a couple of stages. We got the cutting stage where the employees are cutting the wood to make the frame of the guitar. We got the assembly or the gluing department where they're attaching the body of the guitar to the neck of the guitar. We got this string department where they are putting the strings on the guitar. And then the facets go on, and then it moves into the stage called finished goods. Comes out of work in process, goes into finished goods. That's a form of an assembly line. And each guitar goes through that same exact process and that same exact order, and each person does their own job on that assembly line. And that's how we're able to produce so many guitars in a short amount of time. And so that's a form of a technological advancement. Anyone else have any other examples of technology that you see improving right now that will someday be used to improve production? Anything at all? Any ideas? Any modern technology that you're interested in that might help to improve your life somehow? Come on, I know I'm not the only one in here. Any examples? Phone apps, Dario? Yeah, that's a good one. There might be some apps that might help to improve the speed of service somehow. Yeah, phone apps, absolutely. That's a good example. What about self-driving cars? Do you think it'll improve transportation? What about self-flying aircraft? Will it improve logistics? What about supercomputers? Will it improve processing times from the time that I place the order to the time I get the delivery? I wouldn't entirely trust it. Yeah, that's there's a lot of things I don't entirely trust. Especially when it comes to safety. Eventually I think that it'll get there, but it's got a lot of hurdles to go through. But yeah, those are some examples of technology improvements that will ultimately improve productivity. But I will say that in most cases, these advancements in technology cannot beat the human mind. For example, there's a thing called robotic process automation. It's called robotic process automation. What this is we are using computers to handle day-to-day tasks that a human can do, but we find it repetitive. And so we develop computer programs, applications um, ways where the computer can do it for us. Yeah. It's kind of like sending out reminder emails, right? It's like, yeah, I do that for you. I do that manually for the most part. But sometimes I don't have time to do it manually, so I will set a reminder. And that reminder will automatically send for me, right, at certain times. Uh, that makes sense. It cuts down on redundant or repetitive tasks. That's called robotic process automation. There are certain things computers cannot do. Uh, Computers can pretty much do everything. I mean, heck, we got self-driving cars. That's a thing. We got self-flying aircraft. That's a thing. Uh, there's so many things that they can do for us, but there's certain things that they cannot. Computers do not have emotion. They cannot make decisions that require emotion. Like, for example, if I have somebody who's applying for a loan on a house, and I'm a bank person, right, who makes that type of decision, the computer will just simply use your credit score and make an automatic judgment. You'll know within a few minutes, right? Same with a credit card or whatever else. The computer does not have emotion attached to it. It doesn't look at the person, it looks at the number. Human is the only one that can look at the actual person to make a educated decision based off of emotion. So there's certain things computers can do and humans can do that computers cannot replicate. At least right now, anyway. But they're both really important for productivity. Both humans and computers work together in order to improve productivity over the years. And of course, over the next 150 years or so, we would fully expect that uh, there will be more technological enhancements where humans and computers will work together to improve the overall level of productivity. So, what is the function? This is the equation, right? So, this is all the fun stuff that you've all been waiting for. the the total level of production equals technology times all the inputs. All the inputs, we call these functions, are inputs of labor, capital, human capital, labor capital, human capital, and what was N again? I always forget. Oh, natural resources, of course. I always forget the N for some reason. So you have labor, you got capital, human capital, and natural resources. So we take level of technology times labor plus capital plus human capital plus natural resources. We multiply those four together by the amount of technology to get us our total output, which is the total level of production. And of course, we can scale this. The production function, we can put constraints on it. We can scale it by doubling all of our inputs. Technology times the function of labor, capital, human capital, natural resources. If we were to double all of those by 2, it would, of course, cause a doubling of the level of output. We can also increase by a factor of 10% by taking 1.1, which is 10%. Well, it's 10% in the form of a decimal, right? So 1.1 is 110, but the only way to get it is by multiplying it back into itself, right? To get 10%. So 1.1, which is the multiplier for 10%, we can increase the level of output by 10%. using it in this equation. You could even, or you could do the opposite as well. You could actually cut it in half, you know, to kind of figure out the various levels of production. And economists do this a lot when it comes to identifying trends and what would happen if the what if function. It's the same concept applies. You can do divided by one, and ultimately that will cut it in half, or divide by two, cut it in half. Uh, so the overall part shows us the level of output, the productivity. And the productivity is going to depend on the technology, the capital, the human capital, natural resources. Okay, so here's a nice question. I'd like to see what you think. Let's say you only select one of these, okay? Which of these factors or policies, sorry, which of these policies do you think would boost the overall living standards in a poor country in the long run? Any thoughts? In the long run, which will improve living standards in the long run? Any thoughts?
I would say C and D, cash payments for good school performance. So it'd be attendance and performance, and crack
Right.
on government corruption, which I think a lot of money is lost everywhere on that.
That's for sure, Meredith. Yeah, you're 100% right on that. I'm with you on that as well. I think school attendance, that's obviously critical because the percentage of literacy and math skills and all of those, of course, would be tied to that. And so if there's an incentive to improve it, I agree. D, definitely. Every government has some level of corruption around the world, including our own. And I think by minimizing corruption, I think that would improve the overall financial health of the country, which would then in turn be a long-term growth standard. Yeah, I agree with those. Narciso, I saw your comment on free trade. Yeah, free trade, definitely. I think that there is a lot of benefit to that as well. Um, Allowing free trade means we don't have any tariffs. You all remember the conversation we had on tariffs. Tariffs are a tax on imports. So if there is a free trade agreement, which means there's no tax on the imports, that means a lower cost of products at the point of entry. Yeah, I think so. That would have some degree of stability over time. Will it improve the living standards though? Maybe. I don't know. That's a good question. But yeah, I mean, really, all of these are pretty solid um, possibilities. In my opinion, I personally like C. I think C is probably the most applicable because of the school, right? The school attendance. The idea behind it is that if with a long term effect. So if there's a long term effect on literacy rates and math rates by school attendance, I think that would have the greatest impact. Otherwise, I also like A and B, but local firms and foreign firms being offering tax incentives. So, like for example, let's say we have a company from Europe that wants to come to the United States to produce a product. The United States might offer them a tax reduction to attract that investment for that new company to come into our country. And what does that do? It creates jobs, it creates the products, and so that creates more long-term stability. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity in all of those options. So what countries do is they look at how public policy can affect the long-term growth rates through things like savings and investment, diminishing returns, investment from abroad, education, health and nutrition, property rights, free trade, research development, and population growth. If you look at all of these things here, you see the theme, right? So this is kind of all-encompassing. Savings and investment. Why is savings and investment important? Well, uh, there's a two-prong approach here. The more that you personally save in terms and invest into your future through like 401k and other retirement funds, um, even if you do stocks or whatever, the idea here is that you're contributing to your own personal growth in the future, which gives it that long-term effect, right? Because the idea is that you'll be paid in dividends, so to speak, in the future, right? So from that perspective of saving and investment, it makes sense that the government would want favorable policy on saving and investment. Diminishing returns, investment from abroad. We all want direct foreign investment because it's funds that the government didn't have before. Education, of course, very important because there's so much competition across the globe. Health and nutrition, obviously, we want people to live as long as they can, to be as productive for as long as they can. Having property and political stability, absolutely, that can be even more true. Free trade, R&D, population growth, all very, very important for long-term effect. So with the savings and investment, you look at how much you're saving in terms of personal capital, how much you're spending, and how much you're planning to spend in the future. So that's why savings and investment is important from both a personal and global perspective. The idea is that you're investing more in current resources, so you're putting today's money, today's capital, into your future investment, right? The trade-off is that you won't have as much to spend now, and you'll consume less now, but you'll consume more in the future. That's the trade-off. And when there's a reduction in consumption, that means there's an increase in savings. Like, for example, I decided to not go out to eat this week, so I saved the $50, put it in the savings account. Over time, you do that more, that's a lot of money. Okay, so you're reducing consumption now, which means you're saving because you're not spending that same amount that you would have. So what we have is this thing called the law of diminishing returns. The law of diminishing returns tells us that we have fewer resources being used to make the consumption of goods that would be used today, which means that there's more resources to make the capital goods. There is an increase in productivity and living standards over time, and there's a faster growth that's temporary due to the law of diminishing returns. Think of it this way. With all of the growth that we're experiencing right now, there will be a leveling off at some point in the future. That's the law of diminishing returns. In other words, there will be a plateau. There's growth now, there will be a plateau. Then it'll go down a little bit, and then it'll go stable, and then back up. That's the law of diminishing returns when it becomes stabilized. When the investment no longer makes a difference, it diminishes. So that's what this curve represents. You see how it levels out toward the top? That's the law of diminishing returns. It stabilizes and then eventually falls off. It's like a bell curve, right? So the bell curve goes up and then it stabilizes and then it comes down. The law of diminishing returns tells us that the growth rate slows down. So if workers have little capital, it gives them more increase in productivity. Work harder, you get more capital, right? If workers already have a lot of capital, remember the word capital means money. They already have a lot of capital. Then, of course, there'll be slower increases in productivity. If I'm already making a lot of money, do you really think I'm going to want to work harder? No. If I'm not making a lot of money, I'm going to want to work harder because I want more money. If I'm already making a lot of money, I'm not going to want to work as hard because I'm already making a good amount of money. You see what I'm saying? So if you don't already make a lot, you're going to want to work harder to make more. If you're already making enough or you're satisfied where you are, then there's a good chance you'll be less productive. That's what this tells us. And of course, there'll be shifts. There'll be shifts in the productivity. Some countries tend to grow much faster than the rich ones. Rich ones are more stable. Their productivity is a lot lower. This is the United States up here. Yeah. Poorer countries like Mali will have a high growth rate because they're working harder to get more money. It's a very simple concept. Rich countries grow slower because there's less need to work harder. Poorer countries, they need to work harder in order to gain more, to be more profitable. We call this a catch-up effect. For example, in South Korea, they invested heavily into their country in the 1960s through the 1990s. This led to a very high growth rate of 6%, greater than 6%. The United States at that time was at 2%. Right now, the United States probably about 1.8%. Other countries, it's probably a little lower now because of the pandemic, but it's a temporary low. There will be catch-up happening in the next few years. When there's an investment from other countries, it typically leads to additional direct investment. For example, Toyota, who manufactures cars, a Japanese company, decided to open manufacturing plants in the United States in the 1990s and again in the later 2000s. What we see is that is a form of direct investment, foreign direct investment. They invested into property, plant, and equipment that is in the United States to make the cars in the United States. That's called foreign direct investment. When a foreign company like Toyota comes into a different country like the United States and opens up manufacturing facilities, that's foreign direct investment. The foreign portfolio investment is the amount financed with foreign money, operated by domestic residents. What does that mean? The Toyota plant in South Carolina employs American citizens. They're using Japanese yen, converting it to American dollars to finance their operations in America. That's what foreign portfolio investment is. A lot of benefits from this, of course. There's additional cash flow coming into the country, which leads to a stockpile of capital, higher productivity rates, and higher wages. They bring new technology with them. Toyota, for example, they brought in a lot of new machinery that the United States has never seen before. This type of activity is really good for poor countries because in poor countries, they cannot generate enough savings to invest into themselves. That investment needs to come from abroad. And we're starting to see that now. We see countries like China, countries like Germany, countries like Japan start to make foreign investment into countries in Africa. With these investments coming from outside of Africa, we see these other countries starting to grow quickly. And because they're investing in the infrastructure, they're investing in opportunities to grow these other countries by opening up new manufacturing facilities, opening up new schools, investing into infrastructure, things like that. So overall, investment from abroad is typically a good thing, for the most part. There's a couple of problems with it, but most of those problems are political. Education, investment in education, which is human capital, very important, obviously. In the United States, workers' wages increased by 10% based off of the development of new schools and getting people educated, right? Yeah, that's the idea. The more education you have, typically, I use the word typically loosely, you make more. That's the way it works, right? You will get that entry level job. You'll go above. You'll keep getting promoted because you have the education. Versus someone who doesn't, who will stay toward the entry level. That's the way it works. The opportunity cost, of course, is the wages foregone because you decided to go to school. You could be making money now, but because you decided to take this class with Dr. B, you're foregoing those few hours of making money by hanging out with me. But don't worry, you'll make more money when you're done. Healthcare, nutrition. Of course, there's a lot of investment opportunities that can still be done here. Too much of our world's population don't have enough food. They don't have enough access to healthcare. This amount is shrinking, but more needs to be done. Countries that have they're wealthier, of course, their people are going to be healthier because there's more investment in the healthcare. Here in the United States, a little different. Our healthcare system's a little different. It's better than most, I'll tell you that much. You go to some of these other countries and you don't want to see. A friend of mine got sick recently. He was traveling in Mexico. Mexican healthcare, very different than the United States. There you have to pay the ambulance to drive you to the hospital. You have to pay a lot of the doctors in cash, by the way, right then and there. Otherwise, they won't touch you. That's how their system works. So there's a big disparity there. It's different across nations. For poor countries, they remain poor because their populations are not healthy. They don't have the same access to healthcare. There are countries in Africa that still have polio. The United States got rid of polio in the 70s. There are countries in Africa that still have polio. Yeah, it's sad. It perpetrates itself. It's a vicious cycle, as they call. This can be, of course, fixed if those countries were to begin investing in themselves. So it's important to understand the healthcare system because the healthier the individuals are, the more they have the ability to work, right? It's also important to understand how property rights and political situations impact the growth rates. To foster growth, of course, it's important to have rights to individuals within that country. The courts enforce rights. It promotes political stability. Here in the United States, we're very fortunate. We have a lot of rights afforded to us by the government. We protect those rights. we have property rights, which is great. Well, some countries don't have property rights. Like, for example, if you go to China or to North Korea or to Russia or to probably several other countries, they don't have property rights. They don't own the land. They don't own the house that they're in. Although they pay for it, they don't own it. Okay. That's why the rights to the property, very important. It promotes independence. It promotes stability. It promotes a lot of different things. So that's property rights. There's a large contrast. Some rights are hard to enforce. There's sometimes fraud, corruption that goes unpunished. Sometimes the government oversteps their bounds. They take over property without a proper hearing. Like, for example, sometimes the United States government will take property and they'll say it's for public domain. That happens from time to time when the government wants to build a highway, for example. They'll take land from people. They'll pay them, usually not what it's worth, and then they'll demolish the property and build a highway. Unfortunately, that is all too common. People fear governments. They fear other people for various reasons, especially when it comes to politics and property rights. They're afraid that their property will become taken from them. They're afraid that the government will change and all of a sudden you'll lose those rights. That's why it's really important for you to know what your rights are. And knowing your rights and ensuring that laws are enforceable promotes economic stability, efficiency, and honesty, for the most part. Overall, earlier we had said that everyone's usually better off with trade. Remember when we talked about tariffs and we talked about free trade concepts? Well, trade's always good. Why is it good? Because it promotes lower cost of products. It promotes inward-oriented policies, like limiting tariffs, limiting foreign investment. There's an aim to raise living standards. Yeah, all good things. And then, of course, there's outward orientation, which involves things like creating free trade agreements, promoting integration with the world economy. In the United States, we use a combination of both inward and outward-oriented policies. Trade has similar effects with technologies. The better the technology is, the higher the living standards typically are. There's a lot of technological progress through research and development. The technology is improving. Knowledge is improving from research and development, where we're sharing ideas freely to be more productive. And policies, of course, promote technological advances. Living standards over the long run, of course, will improve as technology improves. As the population continues to grow, we see more workers produce goods and services. And of course, it also means that there's more consumers. Although here in the United States, we're actually experiencing a population shrinking to some degree. And of course, there's a negative impact on the natural resources with a larger world population. There's less water, less drinking water. That is, there's less natural resources like mineral deposits because they're being used to sustain growth. And as their populations increase, of course, there's a spread of wealth, which ultimately lowers productivity and living standards. There's government regulation has implemented ways to control growth. Believe it or not, China for a long time had a one-child policy. For every family, they're only allowed to conceive one child. I think that's up to 2 children now. It might be 3. But yeah, some communist countries like China, they have child policy. It used to be 1 child per family. Now I think it's 2 now. But yeah, there's so many interesting things with them. And with a larger world population, of course, we would expect further technology progress, more engineers, more scientists, more et cetera, right? With more people that we have. Okay. We're not going to do the case study. Don't worry. Okay, so that, my friends, is growth and production. Any questions on growth and production? No, you all good? Sure, still awake, huh? Okay, let's roll into savings, investment, and the financial system. This is a pretty short chapter overall. We'll roll into that in just a second.